I came to Brentwood in 1966 and I left in 1972 as superintendent of school, and I replaced Gene Hoyt. Because the name Lou is a derivation from my birth name of Luigi. And as it was customary, I had a grandfather whose name was Luigi. And what's very interesting too, that he came to live with us, so to distinguish between Luigi and Luigi, I became Lou.
Was this your father's father?
Yes, yes.
Did you know your grandparents on your father's side, both of them?
I knew my grandparents on my father's side, my grandmother, and it's a very interesting point. My grandmother lived to 106. She came to this country at age 60 from a little old town in Italy. And of course, the reason she came here is that during the Depression time, Italy was in a bad shape, as was the United States, but we had a farm, and we had chickens, and we had cows, and we had edibles. So therefore, it was a place for them to live, and you could be sort of like you would call the extended family. That's where I grew up.
What was the town that she...
Cornwall. Oh, the town in Italy?
In Italy.
And that town in Italy was called Navi, which is near Lucca, which is in Tuscany, near Florence.
Ah, okay.
And I visited them last year.
Did you? You still have relatives there?
Yeah, but they're going on too.
Okay.
As a sideline, I might have to say, I said to my son, I said, Victor, his name is Victor after my father, and I said, I said, maybe you ought to take an extended vacation, and therefore let's go to Italy and see where your grandparents were. And he said, he's a surgeon, therefore he can't take too much time off. He said, yes. He says, I gave it some thought, and Andrew, which is his son, and my grandson graduated from Wesleyan. He said, as a gift, he says, I think the family will go to Italy. I said, then you need an interpreter, and that's me. So we went to Italy last June.
So you got a great trip out of it.
Oh yes, we went to Rome.
Where was your home in this country? The farm. Where was the farm?
Cornwall, New York, which is about 50 miles north of New York City.
Uh-huh.
And actually, when over there, it was a farm and boarding house. In other words, during the summertime, it catered to people from the city who wanted to go for the open air and good food.
What about your mother's parents?
My mother's parents, I know very little about them, except they used to write. They still stayed over there. I knew my cousins, but that was it.
Were they also Italian?
Oh yes.
They were from
yes,
north
as a matter
of
of fact, one of the interesting observations you could make is that when they came over here during during World War I, and my father at that time. In Italy, you're supposed to serve when you're 18. You're supposed to go immediately for 3 years in the service. And at that time, the need for workmen was so great here that the Italian government said, go to the United States and you can stay there for 3 years and then come back and you can serve. The idea being that if you came here, you could earn money and bring it back to Italy. The same thing that's happening now with the Mexicans, I suppose. So anyway, he came here, and after 3 years, he decided he wasn't going to go back. And my mother, this little lady, came over. She hadn't seen him for 3 years. They met on Ellis Island. And they married there, and they ended up in a rooming house in the Bronx. And that was the beginning. I was born in Jersey City.
You were?
Yeah.
Had the family moved off the farm then?
No, that was before the farm.
Oh, I see.
They moved from Jersey City, moved there. Then when they decided that they didn't want to live in the city, they bought this farm out there, and that's
so you also have memories of the Depression then?
Oh, very much so.
Tell us some of the things that stand out in your memory from the 30s.
Oh, I remember very much because we lived, even though at that time I would have to say that the reason I went into social studies or history was because I figured there were so many mistakes that were made in this period. If we could only learn from history, we will make them again. That was my motivation, because at that time, I lived through a period where that was before you had welfare.
Yes.
You had the people on without work, and my father had a farm, and I remember very well. It was heavily, in those days they didn't have mortgages like you had now. You want to buy a farm, you want to buy a piece of property, okay, I'll give you so much down, and you pay me back in 3 years. That kind of an arrangement. And so what happened during that period of time? Many of the farms were taken over, and it wasn't. FDR said, so long as you pay the interest, you don't lose your farm. So the farm held up.
Okay. What's your present family situation now? You've got sons and...
Yeah, I have. I got married during the service. I got married while I was in the Army, and I was rarely married. We were married for 56 years until I lost her.
Before you go on, tell me how you met your wife.
I met my wife in the Army. I was stationed in Texas, and it seemed to me that I was going to be stationed there permanently. And I met this attractive young lady from a small town, and after a while we saw each other quite a bit, and it seemed to me that this was a lasting arrangement. And when D-Day came, I said, hey, this thing is going to end pretty soon. So I came on furlough up here to see my folks, and I talked to them about this person, and that it was real serious. And I got married in July 23rd, 1944. And that started that. I have to say, though, that in September of that year, I got my orders to go overseas. And I didn't see her for 2 years. So anyway, to summarize it, we got back, and I continued going, and I have to say that the GI Bill made it possible for me to continue, and I got my doctorate. I had my master's, I got my doctorate because of the GI Bill. And that opened all doors.
Sure. Now, you still live out in Brookhaven, is it?
Well, what happened is, after I retired, I decided to go back to Cornwall.
Ah.
Because my mother was still there, and she wasn't well. So I decided to go back, and I got a job with Bosie's. See, I left here, and I got a job with Bosie's, so that with my pension and the Bosie's income, I was able to stay, and I built a house on 1 acre on a mountaintop, beautiful, thinking that my family would come up with me. One daughter, Susan, who taught at Sunquam, got married that year, married a history teacher from Lindenhurst. So that took care of that one. Okay, I still have 2 more. One daughter went to Oneonta, and I figured, well, maybe when she gets through there, she will settle here too. And my son decided to go to Colgate, and when he got through Colgate, he went to dental school in NYU. And when my lady from Oneonta fell in love with a professor, and who eventually ended up at Dowley. And Victor then went to LIJ for a residency in oral surgery, and he got a position here in Mineola. So there we were with that big house up there and all our kids around here, of which I have 6 grandchildren.
God bless. Yeah.
So we decided, let's move back. And so we moved back, and we moved back about 10 years ago to a place in Holbrook called the Colony, a gated community. Mm-hmm. And after I lost my wife, I figured, what's going to happen? Who's going to take care of me? So right now I'm at what you call Jefferson Ferry, which is a long-term care retirement community.
All right.
And I'm there with 200 others.
Okay, all right. And tell me now, you mentioned you lost your wife. What were the circumstances?
Well,
there?
it's interesting enough. I really didn't expect to lose her so quickly. But she had assorted ills all her life. She was diabetic. She had cancer. But what brought it upon, she fell and broke her hip. She fell and broke her hip in September, and she was dead in January.
Okay.
That happened.
Do you get a chance to see the grandchildren very often?
Oh, yes, yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah, they're right there. In fact, I see them quite frequent. That's the reason they're here.
Do
That's
you
the reason
see
I'm here.
do you see family traits in some of the youngsters? Do you see
Yes, indeed.
talents or traits that you've seen before?
Yes, I do. They all look. They're all like her mother.
Ah.
A lovely lady.
Okay. What's the earliest memory that you have?
Of me? My personal memory?
Your personal memory. What's the earliest thing that you remember as a child?
Yeah, I remember going with my father. My father got a job in a cigar factory in Jersey City, Italian cigar factory, Parodi cigar factory. In those days, if you had a factory, it brought about a cluster of all the people around there of the same ethnic group. So that's as a matter of fact, I have to say I couldn't speak English when I went to school. Very interesting point.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, what I remember is going with my father hand in hand to the factory, working with him. That was in I must have been 3 or 5, I must have been maybe 3 years old at that time.
Mm-hmm.
The other significant thing that I remember, and I guess it was a characteristic of many immigrants at that time, and you talk about the immigrants, because to some degree, I follow the pattern of the first generation,
Okay.
because I'm a first generation over here. And I see the pattern. That's how my father came over. He worked hard. He wanted to improve himself. And I don't understand. Here's a man with only a third grade education. And what it did to me, there are times with all of us, in times, you figure, gee, I got this. For example, when I was superintendent of Brentwood, there were problems came up, and you'd say, hey, this is my father, look at my father, what he did. I ought to be able to solve it. So it was that kind of resource that I think helped me.
What did your mother enjoy doing? What gave her
My
pleasure?
mother was yes, I can remember, she was a typical housewife,
Okay.
farmer's wife, from morning to night. In those days, I can remember when we had coal stove.
Yes.
We had the washing machine. You did it by hand with a washboard. So I remember that. She was a typical domestic. And of course, what I learned from that domesticity was the fact, and I think this prevailed. When I got married, my wife and I got married, our primary goal was our family. And it seems to me that I can remember my father, here I am, principal of a high school. And my father had this summer boarding house arrangement.
Yes.
It was a family thing. We had grown up with it all the time. And he would say, hey, 4th of July, and I have 2 kids. I'm living in Levittown. And my father said, Louis, you coming up? I said, but Dad, he says, Louis, I need you. So here I would go up there and he'd go, that's it.
What did your father enjoy doing when he was in his element, so to speak?
Well,
What was fun for him?
Well, he worked hard. He was
know.
in construction.
All right.
He always, I can remember what I remember. You talk about the interesting thing. When we were in Jersey City, there was a place in Jersey City, there was a place on top of a hill where all the Irish people lived. My father decided he wants to move up there. Well, he moved up there and he bought a house. He bought what you could say was an old house with a you could say a dilapidated brownstone. But the first thing that I remember he did, he built a flower pot and he put it right in the middle of the front lawn.
Well, he, like your mother, very hardworking.
Oh, yeah.
They set the standard for you.
Yes, they did.
And for all the children.
Yeah.
And were there adult influences in your early life, Lou,
Yes.
other than your mother and father? Who
Yes.
were the other adults
Yes.
that had a profound effect
Yes,
on your
yes, I
life?
would have to say that. In this business that I'm telling you about, people would come up to the city. These were family things, and there was but one particular person that I remember. He was a few years older than I was, but I sort of respected him, and he went to Columbia College. He became an architect eventually, but at that time he was a friend of the family. His name was Olindo Grossi. I remember him so much. And when it came time for me to decide to go, what am I going to do after high school, somehow or other I ended up at Columbia where he was.
Okay.
So he had an impact on
Yes.
me in that way.
That
An
way.
impact that because in those days I didn't know whether, I remember I wanted to go to, I wanted to be a medical doctor.
Ah,
And I sat my father and he said to me, he says, Louis, he says, you know, he says, in Italy, when you get to be your age, you help out with the family. He says, now I don't, he said, I won't need I don't need your money while you're going to school, college. He says, but I can't afford to send you to medical school. He said, get the best you can. So I went 4 years and got the best you can. And the worst thing I did, major in history. Can you imagine major in history and I graduated in 38? Couldn't get a job.
there have been lots of decisions that you've had to make, both in your personal life and as a certainly as an administrator and then as a superintendent of schools. Some of them have been very joyful decisions that you've had to make, but you've also had many, many tough ones. What was one of the tough decisions you've had to make?
Well, on the personal level, I had to make the decision whether I should move my family, go from one place. It had always been a source of disturbing because in those days, when I was active professionally, a doctorate degree, there weren't that many who had them, and that opened up many doors. I could have chosen not to go on. I could have been retired at Manhasset like some of my friends did. But I decided that I wanted to be an administrator because, as I had indicated to you before, I took up history because I figured if you learn something, you know, you don't have to repeat it again. Then when I started taking courses in administration, now the opportunity really to make a difference in society dawned up. Hey, I'm a principal of a school. I'm going to change society. That was an inspiration. Didn't work out that way, but anyway, you fell for it, right? So, but if I'm going to take that route, that means I got my first job. I got my first job as principal at Half Hollow Hills, and then the decision I had to make. My boss decided he's going to leave, and he left after I was there 1 year. He called me and he said, I'm leaving, Lou. He said, how would you like to take my place? I said, I don't want to be superintendent, or at that time they called him district principal. I said, wait a minute. I said, I don't know my job. He said, Lou, don't worry about it. He said, you can do it, I'll teach you. While the few mains I have there. Well, the board then at that time said to me, says, look, Lou, will you please hold the group together? There were 3 or 4 principals there. Hold them together while we make arrangements, get a new person. I said, fine. Well, it didn't happen. It didn't happen. Meanwhile, they're asking me to assume some of the responsibilities as chief administrator. And I said, hey, maybe I can handle this. But I wasn't so sure. What happened when they finally got the new man, I found out that I couldn't work with him. He was dictatorial, demanding. I had a different approach. Usually in my dealing with, I really very strongly that the impact that school is as good as the teachers, really. And the idea is to make the teachers better. So you work with group dynamics kind of arrangement. And this person, I had to make a decision because I knew I couldn't get along with this man.
But that didn't end there. That happened to you many, many times after that too. There were other people that you find it difficult to work with, and you have to cope.
So, therefore, I got another. So my former boss said to me, he says, Lou, he says, come with me up to Schenectady. So I took my family and we moved up to Schenectady for 2 years. And then moved out here to Longwood 2 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And the decision that I had to make there was very interesting. I had to make a decision there because in Longwood, at that time was Middle Island, there they had a problem, a serious problem in that most of the elementary kids, there were 4 K, 1 through 6 elementary schools. And they went to Port Jefferson for their high school. And Port Jefferson said, we can't take you anymore, build your own. So the district superintendent said, why don't you all get together? They said, no, we don't want to get together. We'll go on our own. The big problem that right in the middle of that district was Gordon Heights. And nobody wanted Gordon Heights. Now, I didn't know anything about that. Finally, they called on me because I had been involved in high school building. They called on me to be the new superintendent. I found this big problem there, which was a problem. But I worked it through.
Good, good. And you were preparing all the while to come to Brentwood?
Well, there were certain kinds of things, yes. I would have to say there was. For example, I would say one of the things that I'm very happy about personally, it came to chance in one of my elementary schools, there was the question of hiring the best person for the job. That's easy said, but there's always a decision that has to be made between 2 people. And the question had to do at that time hiring a black woman. And if I took the position that I did and knowing my background, you would know that to me that's fine. So we had a candidate that I thought was an excellent candidate. The vacancy, however, was in Yaphank. Yaphank was a very small rural community. It had been the scene of the German Bund. And I figured this is going to be a decision for me to make. Get off the pot. So I talked to the principal at that time. I knew you're a fine man. I said, how do you think it's going to work? We'll hire this black lady. Because I had in mind, not only was she good for that, but I had in mind that someday at that high school, she would be moved up to be guidance counselor up there. I had that in mind. He said, I said, look, Merv, here's what you do. We'll hire her and put my daughter in her class. That settled it. And I felt good about it.
You've done a lot of other things, though, to make a buck. When I want to go back and say, when you were a kid, what was your first paying job before you got your degrees and before you started in the field?
Well, of course, having this business that we talked about, I had to be a waiter and all of that. But
so you worked with your family?
Oh, yeah.
That
yeah,
was
we
it.
worked for that.
Okay,
But if you talk about, yes, however, I would have to say this. Now, at that time, the tuition, I'll never forget how, I don't know how in the world I was able to think that I could go to Columbia College. Because although the tuition was $400 a year, but $400 was something I didn't have. And I remember my uncle taking me on the train to go take the train to come to college, and he gave me $5. So maybe I had $25. I ended up at 116th Street with $25. Well, I had to eat. So I started working there, waiting on the tables. And actually, one of the things that I remembered the most, I worked in the cafeteria from 6 to 8 in the morning and got free meals. I took care of that. Then I worked in the library. I worked in the library from 3 to 9 at 50 cents an hour, and that's paid my board. I mean, my room. So I managed.
You managed, okay. What year was it that you arrived in Brentwood, and how did that come to be? How did you get to Brentwood?
Well, what tends to happen in the administrative position that I am, you have, every university has a short list and a long list. For example, let's assume now that Brentwood wants to get a superintendent. It can go several ways and get the district super, and they can hire people, but they'll go to Columbia, they'll go to Harvard, NYU, and there's a list there of people that say, oh yeah, you got this, fits it out. So I was one of the people part on that list. I had been received numerous opportunities on the list. One of the ones that I was on the list was for this job in Bedford Hills, Westchester. Nice community. And I think I told you so I saw Bill Phelan at that time. I said, Bill, what do you know about that? He says, I don't know anything, but I got Brentwood. I said, wait a minute. I can read the papers. It says, I think you can do it. Now, what's interesting about this is I come to the interview at Brentwood, and I says, come to the interview. And at that interview, I was prepared to ask him the questions that are of interest to the superintendent. What is the relationship between the board and the superintendent as it relates to policy and administration? You want to get involved too much in the administration, so forth like that. How do you feel about transportation and teacher development and all those questions? None of those questions were asked of me. The big question they asked me, what did I think about special ed? Because at that time, Brentwood had a big special ed program, probably still does. So I went back and I told Bill Phelan the next day, I said, Bill, forget about it, that's out. He called me back 2 days later. He says, hey, he says, it's between you and another guy, it's between you and a local fella, and really you're the one. So you may remember at that time we had Lee Stewart.
Yes.
And I think at that time, I think this is the reason I got the job. At that time, Sonderling was ill. Jim Lynch was off some other place. So I guess they depended upon Lee to say, you know, we got these candidates, what do you think? Well, I played golf with him a couple of times. He probably said, I think Lou's a nice guy. He said, so now I get to, so I had to decide, so I called up, now my ego's involved. When I received this communication to go back for the interview, all of a sudden my family says, what's going on here? They were in high school, they were in their school there. Wait a minute. I said, you know, I said, I'm going to go back and tell them I'll make the demand. I'll make such demands that they can't accept it. I went back and I said, you know, first of all, I said, you have to pay me more than I'm making now. That's true. I said, and secondly, I said, you know, we're from a small school. My children need to go to a small school, not a big school like that. Okay. I said, and there's another thing. I said, your administrative arrangement is very inadequate. I said, you had too many bosses around here. I said, we have to look at that. And they said, okay. So I got the job, much to the annoyance of my family. And I would have to say that probably, given that situation, the best contribution that I probably made was in reorganizing it so that you had a person that makes recommendations, not this place and that place. And I can remember coming here one Friday night. It used to be Friday night was the public meetings, and the crowds would come over there and berate the board. Finally, I said, now wait a minute. I said, you know, I'm the guy that's responsible. These fellas, these are volunteers. They don't come. They don't know what goes on. So the board liked me for that person. They took it off the back.
How was Brentwood? Certainly at that point, but you were here for a number of years, and you'd had experience elsewhere. How was Brentwood different from other places?
Okay. Yes, and it probably was an attraction for me. I would have to, it grew so fast with so many problems that it had, but it had a reputation. And that the reputation it did because of the so many students that had that at different levels. I think it had the, and Gene Hoyt particularly he was an educational pioneer, if you want to use that word. And he was interested in getting programs. That's the reason we have Fournier and a lot of those guys there with the Ford Foundation and all of that. That was his focus. Unfortunately, and this tends to happen, you have some big ideas, but you've got to be able to implement them. I was shocked to find that you had 14 elementary schools, one librarian, which was constantly, to me, I thought the library was a focal learning center. That was the focal point for each school. So that was disturbing to me. Then you had that monster Sonderling Ross situation there that was difficult to administer. But anyway.
Yeah, but that's one of the ways that it was different, the school.
But with respect to the I felt, having been, my focus being in education,
yeah.
I figured that coming to Brentwood would probably be, I would enjoy it because its focus was on developing education. And as a matter of fact, I don't know whether you remember Art Brieger.
Sure.
You remember Art Brieger? Because I remember this, because we used to have a lot of, some money was available, federal money. And I sat down with it, I said, you know, is there something how can we improve this? Because at that time, the standards, the achievement was not that good. Let's face it. When you take these people coming in from Puerto Rico, they land on the ship there, you know, you have to do something. So we used some money from the federal government for individualized instruction. And it was a beautiful concept. It required testing and so forth. So anyway, it worked out, except the money ran out.
During your tenure, there was a lot of curriculum innovation.
Oh yes.
In the district.
Oh yes.
Matter of fact, Brentwood had a reputation as being right at the cutting edge of curriculum.
Yes. Well, that was because Gene had started it. So it was.
Let me ask you a different kind of question, one that I ask everybody. Your job description aside, what was your purpose in coming to work every day? What was your purpose? You probably told us what it was in other words, but I want you to answer that question.
Yeah, I think so. It seemed to me, and I think I'm glad you asked that question, because to me it seemed that I had to do, my focus was always on doing the best job for the school district. And this, in other words, you knew I knew when I came here that Brentwood was not Garden City. It was not Manhasset, where I was nurtured. But you had to do the best that you could, and you knew, and I can remember talking to Jim Lynch about it. Jim was president at that time. And he would say, you know, Lou, he says, we can only do so much with the money that we have. So I would say, what your answer to your question, my orientation was always on doing the best I can for that district. I wasn't interested in promoting myself. Now I can tell you specifically what happened in an illustration. There was a time when we were looking for building another high. The population was growing. And for some, population was growing. And the question became of building another high school or facilities of some sort. And I had a school board member that came up with some crazy idea. He said, you know, maybe what we ought to do, have an all year round school. So you can have them all year round. Well, I knew this had been tried up before, someplace, but we had problems relating to it. And so he said to me, he said, you know, Lou, if you can make it work in Brentwood, just think what it would mean for you. I said, but I'm not interested in meaning for you. I'm in Brentwood. I said, first of all, I said, you lose. Can you imagine a staff having been resolved like that? Well, he was a thorn in my side. I forget his name, but I thought it was a thorn in my side. Finally, you know what I had to do? I had to get people, friends in the State Department, to come down and say, you know, there's no state aid. That took care of that.
You also looked on the grounds of Pilgrim as a possible
Oh,
location.
And then the politics got into that one. They said, hey, they want to get rid of this beautiful, get rid of it, make a school out of it. That didn't last too long.
No. But nevertheless, you had to walk the walk and do the tours and bring.
Well, in other words, the illustration is, as a superintendent or chief school administrator, I had to focus on what I figured was the best for that district, right, and never worried nothing about myself.
Right. Some of the people you worked with during your early years,
yeah,
from 70, well, you came in 70.
I came in 66.
66, okay, so from 66 until 72.
Yeah.
Who were some of the people that you worked with? You've already mentioned some of them.
Oh, yeah. Well, I thought it was very interesting. In the process there were a couple of things that if you were there, you can remember that Gene or the board had because I viewed the principal as the chief of the building.
Yes.
He is the chief of the building, chief educator, chief administrator. It is sometimes when you don't hire the right principal who views it that way, you don't have educational and development. Apparently that must have been the case because I found myself when I came here, you had two principals for each building. You had the GIS, the General Instructional Supervisor. I said, holy Moses. And I had problems with it because, you know, who's who on this? And here's the General Instruction Supervisor, meets with the staff. I know that the principal says, I don't think so. So that was a real problem for me. And it was money expended. Some of these GIS were very good to be principals, so I made those moves. Some of them I just couldn't. Well, that's it. So
you also were superintendent when the union and the board got together with the district and you had the first union contract.
Well, I got to tell you about that. Gee, we're getting really, you're taking a lot of, I came here in 66. Actually, I took over in 67. My father dies in March. He'd been sick, he dies in March. So at that time, Lee Stewart and I got together, it was a board meeting. and we had to make up a snow day. And so I sat down with Dave. I think it was Dave March at that time. I sat down with Dave, who was president of the U Teachers Association. I said, Dave, I said, you know, we got to make up this day. I said, Howard, let's decide which would be a good day. Okay. So I said to Lee, I said, Lee, I have to go upstate now, but at the board meeting, will you make the recommendation that this is the date that we have decided to have the makeup? Okay. I came back from the thing. I come back to school, and Lee stood where everybody said, there's going to be a strike. I said, what? What happened? Oh, there's going to be a strike. Get a list of all the substitutes. I said, holy Moses. So I went at that time, I went to see the president of the board. His name was Keller?
Irving Keller.
Irving Keller. And he's on the phone, talking with the phone. They said, the teachers, he says, the teachers will all report there. They'll go on strike. I said, oh God, this guy, he's in another world. So, how are we going to do this? So I went back. At that time, I think, and my relationship with the teachers has always been good. I went to see him. I said, you know, how are we going to resolve this thing? What's the problem? Well, they were telling them, it wasn't only the decision. What annoyed the teachers was that here the board made a decision different from the one that we had agreed to. And secondly, they wanted recognition. This was before the Taylor Law Act. They wanted recognition, which I, in effect, granted them.
Yeah.
Didn't make any difference, because I had to work with them anyway. So I went to Irv. I said, Irv, I said, you know, I said, this is kind of silly for us to have a strike under this issue like this. He said, well, he said, oh, this and that. Oh. So I went to, I think it was Guy DiPierto at that time. I forget who it was. I said, you know, I need you, but you need me. If you go on strike, I'll never be able to support you because you're hurting the children. Okay, so I went to Irv. I said, this is terrible. I hate to say this. I'm going to say it, but I hate to tell you this. I said to Irv, I said, you know what we need in the school district? We're growing. We need somebody to do a publicity for us. Our publicity is very negative. We need somebody. He said, Lou, it's a good idea. Yeah, I said, why don't we bring it at the next board meeting, bring it up? He says, you know, I'd like that job. I figured, hey, I said, all right. I said, fine. I said, but you know, we got to settle this thing first. And we'll settle it. Okay. So I went to, didn't have a strike, and the only thing we had to do at the time was how we're going to deal with those teachers that couldn't make it because they had agreed, made other arrangements. And so I remember that time, I taught some classes. But anyway, now we have a sequel of this. So Herb goes before the next board meeting. He says, you know, he says, we need a publicity person. He says, fine, I agree with you. He says, I want to be it. They said, fine. He says, but, he said, let's wait until after the budget is passed. He said, because, you know, it doesn't look right. He says, no, I want it now. He says, you're not going to get it now. He says, I quit. The nice thing that happened. So I got really...
I could talk with you for 3 hours.
I know.
But we don't have it. So what I'm going to ask you now is, at a certain point, you decided that it was time to end your career. You decided retirement was looming.
Yes.
And that happened around 1972.
Yes.
Why?
Well, I think several reasons. First of all, the lure, the attraction of sitting under a tree and reading a book. It was appealing to
Yes.
me. Secondly, financially, I could see my way to it. I had been an administrator now for 15 years, and it gets boring. It really gtes boring. You're prepared. What would happen? You prepare all this stuff like that. You have a board meeting. You change. It gets boring. So a change of pace is desirable. And I had this opportunity then to be a consultant up there, and I said, well, I'll take it.
Okay, good. What were you most proud of having accomplished, of all the things that you did when you were in Brentwood?
I think actually probably the thing I'm finding, I knew you were going to ask me this question, and I really don't know.
Good answer. That's an honest answer. That's okay. How many years did you put in to public education all told?
33.
Okay. Do you remember what you made your first year?
Yes, 1,300. The second year was
1,400.
1,400.
And that's before taxes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And actually, I have a little sequel about that. Some of it. So then I go into the service, and I had a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, and we said, because while we were in the service, when we came back, they paid us as though we had been there.
Yes.
So now we're coming back, and I'm making 2,400. Oh, and there's an interesting thing that happened. This is probably, it's a minor thing, but it's a little history. So now all the men come back from the service, and many of them are being employed as teachers, whereas before the war, most people were women. After the war, men get into the teaching profession, and many of them are married. So we're having difficulty making out financially. So the Manhasset Board, and it's nice, and all of it meant well, said, we will give a bonus for teachers who are married. So they proposed married men get an extra bonus. Well, you can imagine what the single women thought about that. Oh, that was a terrible thing to do. Goes to show you sometimes nice things turn out poorly.
I also remembered prior to the interview we were talking about the visit of Robert Kennedy.
Yes.
And it was during your tenure that the assassination
Yes.
of Martin Luther King
Oh,
took place.
yes.
There were other historical events
Yes.
that took place during those years that profoundly affected what went on in the classroom and what happened from that point
Well,
on.
I've been, first of all, the first one that I remember was not here, but John F. Kennedy.
Yes, yes.
John F. Kennedy.
Where were you then?
Well, I was in Longwood.
You were in Longwood,
Middle
okay.
Island.
Mhm.
That was then. But then, yes, Martin Luther King passed away when I was at Brentwood, and I can remember what happened, how the teachers handled that so well. They gathered everybody in the auditorium, and that helped that situation. Then I had Robert Kennedy, same thing. And of course, what I do remember mostly, of course, at that time was also, I can remember this, we had a riot. We had a fight. We had a fight, and I was prepared at that time. I guess what happened, what promoted it, was an incident that must have happened outside the school,
Sure.
and then when it came here, it continued in school, and this was between a black boy and a white boy, and as the procedure requires, and it was requires, there were a group of them. You had to have what you call a superintendent's hearing. So I deputized a number of people to have the hearing, and then I go before the board to make the recommendations. And I remember this whole thing. So you would expect that the 17, 18-year-old, 16-year-old kid, when you would sit down and talk to them, it was a terrible thing to do. And I said, now, would you do this again? He says, yeah, I would. I couldn't let him into that high school.
No.
So I had to do something. So he was on. We had to pay money to have him tutored at home.
But very often these things were billed as racial in nature when they were just communication
Yeah.
things or conflicts between two people.
Yeah.
What did you miss when you left? When you
Well,
finished?
I'll tell you. I guess now as I'm talking to you, you can know what I'm missing.
I know.
I'm missing the opportunity to talk
Oh, sure.
and to meet people.
But it's different now that we have distance from it, too.
Yeah. Now, for example, I have to tell you, to me, I guess it was a year ago, the two things happened. About a year ago, John Carpenter and Beverly told me that they meet periodically for breakfast someplace. And when it was known that I was there, I was invited to attend, which I did. And I have to tell you, it was a great delight for me to see the people there, and they would come to me and say, you know, you hired me. Well, okay, fine. Give me to believe they remembered me.
Yes.
Then, following that, I think the principals have an alumni meet together, and at that time, Joe Silva invited me. And there I saw Lula Tito and all the people that I'm familiar with, you know.
Yes.
I'm not the kind of guy that, you know, but I enjoy the relationship.
Could you tell us what you didn't miss? What about the position that you had that you didn't miss, that you were glad you didn't have to deal with anymore? Was there anything like that?
Yeah. I would have to say that what I didn't miss, that towards the end of my tenure, my relationship with the board became strained. At one time, I had members of the board there. I had John Currier, Dr. McDonald, Maureen Bellinger, Jim Lynch. These are people that we understood each other very fine. Then we got other people came on the board there, and they were out. I don't know but my relationship then was not the same.
Perhaps they had an agenda that was different.
Not the same.
Yeah.
Now, I felt that if I really wanted to, I could communicate with the public enough. My best supporters was the Brentwood Parent Teachers Association. I was a member of the Long Island Teachers Association and the Parents Association. I worked with them because I figured that if you can get the parents on your side, you're doing well.
That's right.
But it would have been an effort. Now, for example, every time there was a PTA meeting at an elementary school, I was there. So that became tiring after a while.
Yes.
So that part I didn't
Yes.
miss.
Yes, you're always on call.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you would like to have accomplished while you were
Yes.
superintendent,
Yes.
but you couldn't for
Yes.
lack of funds or whatever?
Yes.
What was that?
That high school building that never developed. It was actually the whole question of that. At that time, things have, accommodations have been made. I see they did something with Ross Sonderling and straightened it out. But originally, we were supposed to have a new high school up there by where Suffolk County Community College
right.
is there.
That's right.
And what beat it was something that it should never have happened. Coincidences was being developed and so forth, so on. And then what happened was somehow the board decided to put the transportation up to bid. We used to have somebody that used to do our transportation all the time. And we don't know how much he took advantage of it. So the idea is that, maybe we ought to put it out to bid. Specifications. We put it out to bid, and an outfit from Connecticut won the bid. So this means that all the people who lived in Brentford that were working on the buses, they came out with no votes. So that lost that.
I want you to complete these phrases in a couple of words, if you could. I know it's almost impossible, but complete this phrase or make a sentence out of it. Brentwood students are.
Okay. Most varied group in terms of talent, in terms of interest, and in terms of capability.
Okay. All right.
When you have a school district as large as this one,
You bet.
you know you're going to have some of the best and some of the worst.
Well said. Well
And
said.
you just have to accept it.
Well said. How about this phrase for teachers? Brentwood's teachers are, or they were when you were here.
Well, I found that probably I was amazed that to me teaching is a pretty individual matter, and there's a lot of I think in the size of this school you'll find some good and you'll some bad, and I would have to say that some of the best performances that I have ever seen took place while I was there at Brentwood. Really.
That's great to be able to say. Did you have a favorite year?
Huh?
Did you have a favorite year? Like if somebody says, "Oh, that was my favorite year of."
Yeah, 1944, the year I got married.
Oh, boy. There's a great answer. There is a good answer. Lou, how do you want to be remembered?
Well, I don't know that I want to be remembered, really. You know,
You
guys,
will be.
they're passing by.
Oh, yes.
Like the ships that meet in the night.
I can honestly tell you, you will never be forgotten by those of us who worked with you and those of you who had the pleasure to sit with you today. Thank you for giving us the time.
Well, thank you. This was quite a thing for me.
This has
made
been
me
a positive,
think a lot about. I hope some of the stuff I said there is.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much.
Okay.